Hello, thank you for joining me. I want to talk a bit about the Nobel Prize laureate Aung San Suu Kyi and some of the situation going on in Burma right now. Um, this is an unusual scenario. You have someone who has, at least in the past, been widely revered and widely respected around the world, is seen as an iconic figure of human rights of democracy, and she has went through a transition from being held in that regard to gradually being seen as almost a disappointment or even a phony by some. I was watching the film The Lady last night, Luc Besson film starring Michelle Yeoh. Very good film, very moving, and it's about her struggle and also a big focus on her husband, Dr. Michael Aris, who sadly died of cancer in 1999. And the film basically shows the National League for Democracy struggle in Burma and her role in that. Around the time of the 8888 uprising, going up until the Saffron Revolution in 2007. So this particular decade has been a bit of it's been a strange one for Burma because on one hand you could argue the situation has significantly improved. On the other hand, the conflict situation has escalated. A bit of basic information about Burma is important. Since 1962, the country has been under a military junta. As of roughly 2011 and then 2015, when there were multi party elections, there has been a process of democratization. And Aung San Suu Kyi is basically the figurehead of this. In the film, it shows that she was constitutionally barred from being president due to the fact that she had married a foreigner and spent significant time in the United Kingdom. She speaks fluent English. Now, whether that was a way for the military junta to just keep her out of power can be debated. Today, she is a state councillor, which is essentially the de facto prime minister of Burma. So she has a certain degree of power. This is certainly a much better position that she is in now than she was, a much stronger position, I should say, than she was in 1991. When she won democratically, she won the elections. Her party gained far more seats than the junta, but they basically disregarded the result. And they were widely documented to be one of the world's most brutal regimes. I remember around the time of, well, actually after the Saffron Revolution, at the time of Cyclone Nargis in 2008, very devastating cyclone, tens of thousands of people perished, one of the worst natural disasters of modern times. There were reports that the junta had actually gunned down inmates to stop them escaping. That is how brutal that regime was, and nothing changes that. I still think there is severe human rights issues in Burma, but I think there are things to consider. I've just watched an interview with Fergal Keane interviewing Aung San Suu Kyi, and interviews with her are easy to watch because she has fluent English, so you don't need to rely on translations. She spent significant time in the United Kingdom, and she's an Anglophile in many ways. She has said herself she has great affection for the UK, but it was somewhat an awkward and tense interview because Fergal Keane, who incidentally I regard as one of the finest journalists around, put some testing questions to her, and he basically put it to her that to many people, they feel that she is not saying and doing enough to stop the situation involving the Rohingya people. Now, I've looked at a lot of reports on this situation. I've looked at a lot of different sources, and by all accounts, the situation in Rakhine State is appalling. And I do think there is a strong case to be made that there is state-sanctioned persecution of the Rohingya people. Bangladesh, which is an Islamic country, has done very little to help them. In some cases, sending them back over the border. So these are basically stateless people. Neither Burma nor Myanmar Burma or Bangladesh has really accepted them. What Aung San Suu Kyi has done is basically given generic statements of tolerance and peace. That is difficult, I think, for people to accept when there is allegations of specific persecution. She has denied that there's ethnic cleansing going on. Fergal Keane says he was on the ground and he personally witnessed it. Now, I am inclined to believe Fergal Keane because I think he's a very experienced journalist. He's been to war zones all over the world, so I think his word counts for something. However, and this is very important, I think there are some important things to learn from this. I think that some of those who are criticizing Aung San Suu Kyi, some of the criticism is unfair, and this is why. Number one, she does not have absolute power. She doesn't have jurisdiction over the military. That is something that is still being reformed, still being addressed. She has said herself that the National League for Democracy has been trying to change and amend the constitution so that issues like this can be addressed. Just turning off a light. So that issues like this can be addressed. What critics need to understand is that democratization does take time, and human rights is something that will not, improving human rights is not a situation that will change overnight. I do think there are certain things that raise questions. So, for example, the Burmese government, which is de facto today led by Aung San Suu Kyi, has refused a UN investigation into what's going on in Rakhine State. I don't think that is going to help in terms of criticism. I think she's wrong to refuse that because it isn't going to help the deflection. She has been saying basically that her hands are tied and she's been trying to downplay the situation. She has said that Rohingya refugees are welcome to come back and she assures them of their safety. Well, that's quite a big thing to say. However, like I say, I think there's something to be learned from this. I think one problem was that with Aung San Suu Kyi, people put her on a pedestal, expecting her to be superwoman and do everything. I think that is a bit unfair. Now, the president of Burma, U Kyaw, I think that's the correct pronunciation. I'll try again. U Jaw. I think the K in Burmese is pronounced as a J, and the U is a sort of ceremonial title like Mister. He is the first civilian president since 1962, so again, that is symbolic of some improvements. I do think if we were to compare the civic situation in Burma today, 2017, compared to, say, 2007, I think there have been significant improvements. That has to be welcomed. But in terms of the ethnic conflicts going on, arguably they have escalated. And the collective internal conflict in Burma, which is a very abstract term because this is not one conflict. There's various conflicts going on with the Karen people in Kachin State, in Rakhine State. It's not a single conflict, but that's been going on since, well, for a very long time, since at least 1948. So, in that sense, it's one of the world's longest running conflict. No individual person can be expected to change that situation overnight. There's deep seated ethnic divides going on. And if you look at other examples around the world, because Aung San Suu Kyi is now being compared unfavorably to other iconic figures like Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa. She said she has never compared herself to Mother Teresa, and it would be unfair to do so. One thing that's sometimes forgotten about Aung San Suu Kyi is that she herself comes from a military family. So I don't think, even though she used non-violence as her mantra in the National League for Democracy's movement, I don't think when push comes to shove, Aung San Suu Kyi would be an outright pacifist. And that's something I would not criticize because I am not a pacifist. I believe that outright pacifism has flaws. Nelson Mandela was not a pacifist. Again, it's something that's sometimes overlooked. But those other great figures, they all had their flaws as well. What Fergal King put to her was that Mahatma Gandhi stood up for the Muslim minority and he paid with his life for doing so. Okay, but Gandhi has also been criticized in some quarters for some of his approaches. For example, in the Salt March, he encouraged elderly protesters to go up against the might of the British Army. They ended up being beaten by truncheons. Gandhi continued to push for that sort of technique, so in some ways he was being reckless. Of course, the British Army, the British Raj had blood on their hands, absolutely. But there were other areas Gandhi made statements that were questionable. He was alleged to have had racist attitudes to black people. He was alleged to have been a womanizer. Um, the point I'm making is not to kind of snipe at these great people, it's to point out they were ultimately people. Nelson Mandela, again, iconic figure, and what he done in South Africa was incredible. He basically helped that country to avoid civil war. He spent 27 years in prison and came out and forgave the people who put him there. That's utterly astonishing. However, Mandela, in my opinion, was too complimentary to some left wing dictatorships. He praised Castro, he praised Gaddafi. These were men who did not deserve praise. And that is, in my opinion, a sticking point with Nelson Mandela. Another thing about Mandela was that because he was such an iconic figure for the anti apartheid struggle, people overlooked the fact that his presidency was not actually outstanding. He didn't arguably do enough to stop the rise of HIV, the HIV epidemic in South Africa. Um, but this is not necessarily something that you would hold entirely against him, because ultimately what it comes down to is that there's something that we need to learn from this, that even great figures who are widely admired have the shortcomings. And this is why, actually, there's one point in the film, and I'm not sure if it's true, but I could believe this based on her own commentary, where she said, "You know, I don't like that whole cult of personality." Now, that is something that I think we need to take away when we think about iconic people. No human being in history has been perfect. And I do think there are some areas that she could help in terms of the criticism that has been directed to her. She can help change that reputation somewhat. For example, I think she should allow UN inspectors in. I think that is a big mistake, and I think that is raising legitimate questions. On the other hand, I do think that people need to remember she doesn't have absolute power within the Burmese context. That's the whole point of democracy, that someone doesn't have absolute power. Maybe she should be more outspoken, but there is another risk to that. Remember that Burma is a majority Buddhist nation. Now, if she was to give the impression that she was taking the side of the Rohingya by forcefully speaking out in their favour, that would actually polarize her own supporters. And it would also polarize her position in Burmese politics. Ultimately, she is also a politician. So she also has to think in terms of realpolitik. What one problem I find with some human rights commentators, now don't get me wrong, I'm a staunch believer in human rights, but I think sometimes one problem with human rights commentators and activists is they're extremely idealist. And that's a good thing in some ways, but it's not a good thing in terms of expecting things to change overnight. It's not a good thing in terms of not appreciating the position that she is in as a politician. And as a politician, she has to think very careful about every decision she makes. I can totally understand the concern and the anger and the disappointment that is going on in terms of the situation with the Rohingya. I will also point out, though, to Muslims who are criticizing her, there's a lot of hypocrisy there. I do wonder, would they be as outspoken about the persecution of minorities, which happens in pretty much every Muslim country? So you have this one situation of a Buddhist majority country where there is arguably persecution going on, although I would argue to present it as entirely one sided isn't entirely accurate. It's a conflict. I don't think it would be fair to say that the Rohingya are 100% innocent. Um, but, these things are very complex. And I think what we learn from Aung San Suu Kyi's story, firstly, don't elevate people to such a position where you expect them to do everything. Secondly, I think whilst human rights is extremely important, and I personally am a staunch believer in human rights, I also think that every country does have a different context, and what might work, for example, in South Africa wouldn't necessarily work in Burma, and what would work in 1960s United States wouldn't necessarily work in Burma. Different countries have different constitutions. There is different approaches to take in terms of that process to democracy. So I'm sort of somewhere in the middle with this. I understand the criticism, and I think she can do some things to decrease that criticism. For example, let the UN inspectors in. I think it's a big mistake to give this impression because Burma has been opening up. So I see no reason why they shouldn't be there in to do their job. Um, in that regard, I think she's making a big mistake. On the other hand, I think it's wrong to expect her to do everything and expect her to really, really forcefully speak out and say, I condemn the military. She has to work with the military after all. So there are a lot of things to consider. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. That's how I feel about the situation. And I think people really need to consider that. I think some of the criticism is valid, but I also think that people are in some ways expecting too much of her. Yes, she's a Nobel Prize laureate. Yes, she has been revered, but Nelson Mandela didn't achieve everything. Martin Luther King didn't achieve everything. And Mahatma Gandhi didn't achieve everything. So why put expectations on Aung San Suu Kyi when those other great leaders had their shortcomings as well? That's how I feel about it.